I think this is maybe 7th or 8th time we've had open comments by our community, and I thank our administration for allowing that to happen, and for the equity summit that we put on to give others in the community a chance to speak on this. I personally have learned a lot by hearing others. Sometimes the best way you can be a leader is to listen, and we've listened. And I do appreciate all that have given comments, and I appreciate all that have been polite to others giving their comments. I think we've all learned something from this. I have close friends and relatives on both sides of this issue. I know that when I leave here, I'm going to, I hope not lose friends, but I'm going to probably disappoint friends because I can't make a motion that can please both sides. I have to make a motion today that's not just based on Max Parker's beliefs, but on what I think is best as a school board member, a school board trustee, as to what's the best for the children of our school. I've gotten several emails that start off, I know you've been threatened, I know you've been pressured, and I want people to know I've not been threatened, I've not been pressured. I've had dozens of emails. They were all well stated, and persons that have spoken to me in the community have not pressured me in any way. I do not look at this, I know some of you do, as a political issue. I am not going to try to make sure one side or the other wins or one side or the other loses. You know, I have to keep my mind focused as to what's best for the children of our school. I've tried to educate myself by reading dozens of articles and excerpts from books. It's been a great learning experience for me. As I said, I'm an attorney, and I listened in on a webinar while we were doing it virtual with our office, and the webinar had to do with attorneys, and it said sometimes you lose cases and you don't understand why the jury could vote the way they did. And yes, that's happened to me. And he used this famous phrase that I had not heard before, which was, we see things not as they are, we see things as we are. We see things not as they are, we see things as we are. And basically was saying that everybody has their own experiences, their own education, their own training, their own Facebook groups, their own TV news channels that they watch, and they connect their dots by what they know and what they're experiencing, and we sometimes connect our dots and come up with different conclusions, but we feel passionately that we've connected it the right way and that others may not have connected it the right way. And that's part of what's going on here. Many of you are very passionate on your side, and you have difficulty understanding why someone else could be feeling the other side. And I'm trying to, as best I can, learn both sides. There was an article that was written a couple of months ago by General Neller, who had just retired as the Marine Commandant for all the Marine Corps. And he wrote a letter to America, is what he entitled it. And in it he said we should use introspection and do our best to understand why we all have different opinions on these issues involving racial inequality. And I'll quote, he mentioned what black Americans should be thinking about, which was you need to if you're going to protest, you need to do that peaceably. But he said to white Americans, which is speaking to me, he said, even though you believe you're not racially prejudiced and that you raise your children to judge others by their actions and values, not their ethnicity, you have to try as best you can to understand the views of people of color who are just tired of the real injustices they live with every day. Things that you either have not seen or cannot see, that is their reality. Many of you have mentioned that reality. Many of you have spoken from both sides saying the other side needs to learn their history. So I tried to look at my history and the history surrounding this issue so that I could better understand and do the best I could to make the right decision. So first I looked at my own personal history of how I would have connected the dots before this started. And I grew up in Comanche, Texas. Some of you may know that city. I had no blacks in my class. There were no blacks in the city. There were no blacks in the county. I played against blacks from other schools. I think they were all treated with dignity and respect. I enjoyed the competition. I don't know what their viewpoint was on it. I went to the University of Texas. I was fortunate enough when I went there to be chosen as a walk-on the football team, which was coached by Darrell Royal. There was one black player on the whole team. The very first black player they had ever had on the team. The year before I'd come, University of Texas was the last school to win a national championship with an all-white team. Now, I was only a walk-on for 4 weeks. I got hurt. That black player was named Julius Whittier. He became an attorney, a very prominent attorney. He died 2 years ago. And he was the first black player to become a letterman at the University of Texas. And the University of Texas is going to put a statue of him in their museum at the stadium in the years to come. My grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, was Edmund Jones II. He died in the Civil War fighting for the Confederacy. All my life growing up in Comanche, I always was on the side of the Confederacy when I'd play with my brothers with the little toy soldiers, and Robert E. Lee was my favorite. This was family. I didn't know much about the war. I knew very little about slavery, but that's what I grew up with. So I didn't have a lot of experience with what black persons what their reality was. My children, I have 5 children. They all graduated from Central, and they were all in athletics, and they would bring their friends home, and many times we had African American black children in our home, and they were very nice. But I just say all that because I realized I am not going to be very good to connect all the dots to know all of what everybody's feeling just based on my experiences, by the way I see things as we are, as me. So that's why I tried to study more to try to get a better concept of what everyone is feeling. I studied the history of Robert E. Lee to try to know more about Robert E. Lee. As I said, he was my hero. I knew that he was a great technician. That's why I wanted to be Robert E. Lee when we played soldier. He was always the smartest. He was the best. I knew that when he surrendered humbly, he surrendered nobly. He gave Ulysses S. Grant his sword. He asked for permission for his soldiers to be able to keep their guns so they could go home and use that for hunting and be able to support their children. He surrendered because he did not want any more men to die. I did not know that he had ever owned slaves, but when I studied that, it doesn't appear that that was a big thing in his life. He only held a few in maybe his name, and then his wife, when her father died, he was chosen to take over that plantation and run the plantation, which was in severe debt. And the will supposedly said that in 5 years all the slaves were to be freed, but some of the slaves said that the master of the plantation had told them when he died they were going to be freed. So there was an argument about that. And Robert E. Lee did free the slaves after 5 years, but he didn't free them on the death of the master. And supposedly when some of those slaves ran away, as an example to others, he had them beaten. Some of you have mentioned, and you're correct, that Robert E. Lee, I don't think he liked slavery. I don't think he had a heart for that. He, in a letter to his wife in 1856, he wrote, "Slavery is a moral and political evil." But in that same letter, he also stated that slavery was a greater evil to white people than to black people, and that black people were better off living enslaved in America than living free in Africa. Many of you said, and I wanted to believe it, that Robert E. Lee really didn't have a choice. He loved his states, and at that time the United States was only 80 years old, and there was still a lot of people that favored states' rights versus the rights of the United States, the federal government. And he chose, when he knew there was going to be a battle, to leave the Union Army and go to Virginia, which he thought would be to defend Virginia from the Union Army, but the Confederacy fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, and it was the Unions coming to defend the battle that had been started by the Confederacy. He went to West Point. He was number 2 in his class. He had a lot of friends who were graduates of West Point, many from the South. But 49% of the West Point graduates that were from the South, when the war broke out, fought for the Union Army. They didn't fight for the Confederacy. Sam Houston, who is a great hero fighting for the rights of the state of Texas, in the Battle of San Jacinto for Texas independence, later became the first president of the Republic of Texas and the 3rd president of the Republic of Texas and the 7th governor for the state of Texas, loved the state of Texas as much as anyone could love their state. But he was the governor when Texas put it up to vote for secession, and he voted against it. And when he would not take the pledge to the Confederacy, he was kicked out as governor. So he made a different choice than Robert E. Lee did. And this is something I read that I know some of you mentioned, but it made me think. It says, what if the South had won the Civil War? Slavery would have been preserved. Our flag would be the stars and bars, not the stars and stripes. We would not say a pledge to the flag which recites, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." We would have a pledge to the Confederate flag. Now, I also wanted to study the history as best I could of what was going on in 1949 when Robert E. Lee Middle School was named. I couldn't find much. I did find the minutes of the meeting. I did find the articles that were written in the newspaper. There wasn't a lot mentioned about it. At that time, we had 7 men on the board, I'm assuming all white men, a white superintendent, because there was not much diversity even with women at that time. The board minutes read, the school was named on May 17, 1949. The new junior high was named Robert E. Lee Junior High, and the old junior high was renamed Thomas A. Edison Junior High. They were both named on the same night. Now, what else was going on in 1949 at that time? I know the names of those 7 members of the board. I'm not going to mention them because I don't have anything bad to say about them. I don't have any evidence to show that they were racist or had any ulterior motives when they named it Robert E. Lee. But Robert E. Lee was going to be an all-white middle school, so keep that in mind. But what else was happening in 1949 was that the black men that came back in World War II just 4 or 5 years before had fought for the freedom and thought that they would have better rights when they came back, and they didn't. They couldn't get jobs, and when they got a job, they couldn't get jobs that paid as much as a white man. There was segregation in the armed forces. They had to fight in black army groups. They had segregated transportation. Black restaurants, white restaurants, black churches, white restrooms, black restrooms. They couldn't get elected to office because at that time there was not any single-member districts. Not many blacks registered to vote because they'd been what's called disenfranchised to vote. Blacks that went to trial rarely, if ever, had a black on their jury. President Truman ordered integration of the armed forces in 1948, a year before the school was named, and that caused a big uproar in the country. In the 1948 Democratic Convention, President Truman had part of his platform was desegregation of schools. That outraged many of the Southern Democrats, and they split off from the Democratic Party and formed the Dixiecrats. And they put up Governor Strom Thurmond from South Carolina as the candidate to run for president for the Dixiecrats. And his stump speech, which was pretty famous at the time, would say this: "All the bayonets of the army cannot force the Negro into our homes, into our schools, our churches, and our places of recreation and amusements." President Truman won, but Strom Thurmond carried 4 states, southern states. That was top of mind, I'm certain, in the state of Texas 5 months later when they're naming this school. As I said, that school board may have thought there will never be any minorities going to this school. I can't criticize them at all. Now, I looked also at the demographic changes since 1949, and I think that's important. In 1949, there were 640 students in the school, all white, no blacks. In 1968, about 20 years later, it's very difficult to find this information, but at that time there were 975 students, 829 were white, 25 were black, and 37 were Hispanic. So it's still almost a totally white school 20 years later. Now, I think these figures are either from 2018 or 2019, we have 1,130 students, 339 are white, 55 are black, and 705 are Hispanic. So it's 62.4% Hispanic, 4.9% black, and only 30% white. There's been a huge change since this school was first built and first named. Now, I also read articles that was like, why is the black community, why is the name Robert E. Lee and the Confederate flag so kind of lightning rods when things happen to them? In the year 1900 up to about year 1930, the blacks were having to contend, as some of you have mentioned, with Jim Crow laws, which were the separate but equal, like I mentioned. Everything segregated, where you sit on the bus, where you sit on the train, where you can go to eat, where you can go to church. But they also, as I said, there was disenfranchisement going on. They were not encouraged to vote. They were discouraged to vote. They had to pay poll taxes. They had to take literacy tests to be able to register to vote. So not many blacks were voting. So some of the blacks began protesting. They kind of had the start of the civil rights movement. And when that happened, that's when most of the monuments that were built up until 1930, from probably 1920 to 1930, most were built for the honoring Confederate generals. The blacks knew, they felt it. When they started protesting, these monuments go up. And the monument that was by far the number one was Robert E. Lee of the Confederate generals. In World War II, when the blacks came back, as I mentioned, and they started having the problems that I mentioned with the desegregation movement, with the still having problems with being able to get jobs and so forth. And that's when what's called the modern civil rights movement started. Then that's when the schools started being named, because we're talking about desegregation. That's when schools started being named for the Confederate generals. From 1948 on is when most of the schools were named. A little over 52, as best I can count, schools were named for Robert E. Lee. The closest any other Confederate general in number was Stonewall Jackson with 13. It was by far Robert E. Lee whose name was being put out there. He had become a symbol, along with the Confederate flag, to many blacks and to many white supremacists, a symbol for white supremacy, slavery, and segregation or segregation. I've heard many people, and I studied this, about erasing history by changing a name. If we change the name of Robert E. Lee, are we erasing history? Well, as I said, the night that Robert E. Lee name was put on that middle school, we had Thomas Edison name put on the middle school. We changed the name of Thomas Edison Middle School 10 years ago to Central Freshman Campus, and to my knowledge, not one person came to protest that name change, and no one said, even though they probably graduated from Thomas Edison Middle School, that they thought their history was being erased. If changing the name erases your history, then all my history in Comanche, Texas has been erased, because I can't go show my children my elementary school, middle school, high school. It's all gone. It's all been changed. The hospital I was born in is gone. It's changed. The church I grew up in is gone. It's been changed. When I moved to San Angelo in 1977, my office was in the Continental Building. Right next door was Penny's. It's now Myers. The drugstore on the corner is now Fuentes. The West Texas Utilities was across the street. It's now the Trans-Pacifico Railroad building. Holcomb Blanton, where we got all our supplies, is now the Zero L. Hemphill Wells is now the Stevens Library. Central National Bank is Wells Fargo. Sears building is now the Ed B. Keyes Library, or Ed B. Keyes building. A name on a building, when it is changed, does not change history. This building that Robert E. Lee's name on was built to educate children. It was only when it was nearly completed that they put a name on it. They didn't build this building as a monument or a tribute to Robert E. Lee. When we talk about the cost, if we wanted to change the name, we asked Dr. Lettoff to give us, not to fudge on the cost. And he didn't. He said $75,000. But when he says it's been budgeted, I think you need to understand this. He said it earlier, but I don't know if you caught it. Out of that $75,000, $62,000 of that is for uniforms. That's budgeted because we're going to spend $62,000 every 2 years on uniforms, whether it's Lee Middle School or anything else. That money can't be used for education or academics or so forth. It's going to be used for uniforms regardless of what the name of the school is. The only money that's new money is about $2,300 to repair and take the Lee name off the gym floor, and $9,000 for a new marquee. So that's really the money is going to be about $12,000 or $13,000 to change the name of the school. That's going to be what you would call new money. All right. I told you, and I really haven't changed my mind in a lot of ways. I have the highest respect for Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is not, in my opinion, the cause of this. What would he say if he was here today? Now, I don't have to make this up because I can use his own words. He was asked to go to Gettysburg for when they were going to have some memorials there in 1869, and he didn't go. He said, we don't want to do this. We not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of a war, to commit to oblivion the feelings from that war. Now, I'm not the best on vocabulary, but when he said we should endeavor to obliterate the marks of a civil war, I looked up obliterate, and that means to destroy or wipe out anything that's a memory of that war. And to commit to oblivion the feelings of that war, oblivion means to completely forget. There's a man named Jonathan Horn who wrote a biography of Lee called The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. And he says, Lee believed countries that erased visible signs of civil war recovered from conflicts quicker. He was worried that by keeping these symbols alive, it would keep the divisions alive. Underlying it all was one rationale. The war had ended, the South needed to move on and avoid more upheaval and not cause more division because of these monuments or other symbols. So as I said, I don't think we're here because it's Robert Lee Lee's fault. He didn't want his name there. And I think what has happened is we have a situation exactly as he predicted, something that his name has now become a symbol that is a lightning rod for white supremacists when something happens in the black community, or to the black community when something happens in the black community, along with the Confederate flag. And I think Robert E. Lee would say something like this: I'm honored you have my name on this building. But if you had asked me in 1949, I would have said, no, don't put my name on that building. It's going to cause division. And I today say the same thing. Take my name off this building. It's causing division. Now, that's the Robert E. Lee that I know. That's what I think he would say. Now, I looked up the school board in 1955, when San Angelo desegregated. Some of you, I heard at some of those meetings, that summit meetings, said, oh, there was 4 of the same school board members that were in 1949 were on the 1955 board. No. Again, I don't have anything bad to say about the board of 1949, but the board of 1955 was completely different, 7 different men, and a completely different superintendent. Whether they would have chosen the name Robert E. Lee in 1949, I don't know. I'm not going to guess on that. But I will say the names of the board members in 1955. Frank Poole was the president. I can tell from his obituary he was age 37 at the time. Marion Balch was the vice president. Homer Jordan was the secretary. Alvin Hay was on the board. He was 35. Dr. W.T.B. Roundtree, Earl Smith was age 35. Kurt Steib, age 35. Now, those that I knew the ages and looked them up, I knew all those men. Frank Poole, Alvin Hay, Earl Smith, Kurt Steib. When I moved to San Angelo, they were probably in their 50s, and I got to know all of them. Not that well, Frank Poole. I just knew he was a very honorable man. He was a young man when he was president of the school board. Alvin Hay is John Hay's dad, but he's an accountant, and I always had the utmost respect for Alvin Hay, a man of integrity. But the 2 I knew the best were Earl Smith and Kurt Steib. Because when I moved to San Angelo, those were the 2 district judges for San Angelo and the men that I had to practice and try cases in front of. Earl Smith was a deeply religious man, attended the Church of Christ. Kurt Steib was also very religious. He was Episcopalian. And they would both take me aside after I tried a case, and I began to look forward to it, win or lose, and they would tell me how I could be better. And they would call Mr. Webb or Mr. Stokes and compliment me when I did well, and ask them to give me pointers if I didn't do well. They were my mentors. And I remember a meeting that we had somewhere. I don't remember what was going on, but when they were probably my 65 or so and I was 35, someone asked them, when you voted for desegregation in 1955, one of the first school districts to ever do that, wow, that was a big deal. What was going on in your mind? And I think it was Judge Stibe that said, we were just young, and what we did was based on it was just the right thing to do. It was just the right thing to do. We had no idea that other school districts were going to fight desegregation for 10 or 15 years. We didn't know we were going to be one of the first. It was just the right thing to do. So as I said, I think the problem here is not Robert E. Lee or even what Robert E. Lee did in 1865. It's what's happened with his name since then. And it's been put in the forefront with the monuments, with the schools, all that being done during the time of the Civil Rights Movement that has now caused his name to become a symbol of racism, white supremacy, segregation, along with the Confederate flag. Those are the two lightning rods that I can think of. Not his fault, but it's a reality now. And I think with the present demographics that we have in this school now, I think it's time to change the name. Will that eliminate all the distractions? I don't know. Will it eliminate distraction for some of the students? I hope so. I pray it will. Nobody knows for sure. But I think right now it's the right thing to do. So, Mr. President, here's my motion. And this is my wording on the motion. I think it's time we retire the name of Robert E. Lee from Robert E. Lee Middle School. And we rename it. That's my motion. I don't think Robert E. Lee needs to be hung in effigy. I don't think that this should be a great celebration that the Wicked Witch is dead type thing. I also agree with those that I think this is not a motion, but this is just a request, that we do in our library. We have a Civil War section. We allow people to donate whatever they want to that section to make it the best Civil War library in the city. And that we also have another section that's the history of our middle school, and we let anyone to donate whatever they want there to help them make that that we remember Lee Middle School. I also think, and I agree with those persons, if I get a second to this motion, which I might not, and if this motion passes, which it might not, but if we do that, I think the new name should not be of a person, but should be like some of the names that were mentioned: Legacy, Unity, Lone Star, Concho Valley Middle School, Twin Mountains Middle School, whatever. But not for a person, or we very well could be back here at some board at some point in time. Now lastly, I have one other thing. What few friends I may still have left out there, I'm going to probably lose them now. For Max Parker, if this passes, there's not going to be any domino effect. This is it for me. For those that have mentioned John Reagan and we need to change John Reagan Elementary School, I'm not going to entertain a motion for that. John Reagan is not a name that is a lightning rod for slavery, segregation, white supremacy. John Reagan was a member of the 2nd Legislature of Texas. He was a state district judge. He was a U.S. congressman from the Eastern District of Texas. He did speak out at the secession for slavery and for secession. He was chosen as a Postmaster General for the Confederacy, mainly in charge of getting communications around. He was taken after the war to a federal prison in Boston Harbor for 6 months, and while he was there, he wrote letters back to the leaders of Texas that said, "You need to admit slavery was wrong and to allow blacks to vote, or things are going to get very harsh during Reconstruction." And the leaders of Texas laughed at him and wrote him off. And after they found out later that he was prophetic, that everything that he predicted came true, then others in Texas encouraged him to run again, and he was elected back to the U.S. Congress. He was one of those that helped raise funds and helped complete the Washington Monument. He was the chairman of the Committee on Commerce that was responsible for passing the Interstate Commerce Act, which is one of the most important acts that was ever been passed by our federal government that regulated railroads. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1987 and then appointed by Governor Hogg to be the chairman of the newly formed Texas Railroad Commission, which supervised Texas railroads. And later he founded the Texas Historical Association. He died in 1905, and we named that elementary school for him in 1908, before there were civil rights actions or anything else. He was named one of the 4 greatest statesmen in the 1800s in Texas, along with Stephen F. Austin, Governor James Hogg, Sam Houston, and John H. Reagan. John H. Reagan is not known for anything. He's not a lightning rod. He's not really known much for what he did in the Confederacy. So I'm not going to vote to change that name or any other name of any other school that we have at SAISD because of those same reasons. So I'm just saying that's my feeling. I'm not expressing the feelings for the rest of the board. So I'm sorry, Mr. Lehman, I got very long-winded, and I apologize for that. I just wanted everybody, whether this motion passes or not, to be very clear that I've done my best to study this issue and the reasons that I have made this motion. So I'll leave it up to you now and see if anyone cares to second the motion.
Second. Thanks, Mr. Parker. So we have a motion from Mr. Parker and a second from Mr.